He was not a man given to flights of fancy. Dr. Aris Thorne was a historian of the most meticulous order, a curator of dusty facts and forgotten dates. His life was a neat stack of index papers, each one a testament to his belief that truth resided not in grand narratives, but in the specific, verifiable details left behind. He believed in what could be seen, touched, and catalogued. And then they unearthed the slab. It was found during a routine excavation beneath the ruins of a Roman basilica, a site in northern Italy that had been a puzzle for decades. The slab itself was unremarkable, roughly hewn, petrified wood, hardened over millennia into a stony texture. It lay beneath a layer of compacted clay and volcanic ash, preserving it from the ravages of time, but etched into its surface, with a precision that defied the apparent crudeness of the material, was a single, unfamiliar sigil. The sigil was a marvel of geometric simplicity and profound complexity. It was not a pictograph, not a letter, not a known rune. It was a series of interwoven lines, a knot of arcs and angles that seemed to resolve into itself, a closed circuit of pure form. Thorne's first instinct, his trained academic reflex, was to categorize it. He spent weeks in the archives, cross-referencing every known symbol system from the ancient world cuneiform, hieroglyphs, Etruscan script, even the intricate knotwork of Celtic art. Nothing matched. The sigil stood alone, an orphan of history. His colleagues, a chorus of polite skepticism, suggested it was a one-off, a decorative flourish, perhaps an early form of graffiti, an artistic whim. One of them said dismissively over lukewarm coffee, "Not everything has a deeper meaning." Aris Thorne, however, could not shake the feeling that they were all missing something fundamental. He had looked at millions of symbols in his career, and this one felt different. It didn't feel like it represented an idea. It felt like it was an idea. It felt less like a word and more like a name, or perhaps even a command. His obsession began quietly, a small intellectual itch that soon became a consuming fire. He began to research not the sigil itself, but the nature of symbols. He dove into the works of forgotten mystics, Gnostics, and alchemists, texts he had previously dismissed as the ramblings of unscientific minds. He read about the medieval idea of the signature of all things, the belief that God had inscribed the properties of every plant, stone, and star with a unique mark. He read about the Kabbalistic notion of ladders as the building blocks of creation, each one a divine vessel for a different aspect of reality. He began to see a pattern, a recurring theme that transcended culture and time, the belief that a symbol, when crafted with the proper intent and focus, could cease being a mere representation and become a direct conduit to the thing it represented. He learned of shamanic traditions where a drawn line wasn't a picture of a river, but a summoning of its spirit. He read of ancient magicians who would create intricate sigils not to pray for an outcome, but to compel it into being. This was the core of his intellectual breakthrough. The sigil on the slab wasn't a passive symbol, a linguistic marker of something else. It was an active agent. It was a direct form of communication, not with other people, but with the very fabric of reality itself. A sigil was a shortcut, a way of bypassing the clumsy, imprecise medium of language and thought to get straight to the underlying structure. Thorne's research became a solitary, nocturnal pursuit. His office, once a bastion of order, became a chaotic web of photocopies and notes, illuminated by the cold glow of a desk lamp. He started experimenting, though he was careful to frame it and did it in academic terms. He began with simple geometric forms found in ancient texts, trying to replicate the process described by the old mystics. He would draw a circle, a triangle, a line, and focus all his intellectual energy, all his scholarly will, on a single, precise intention. For a historian, a man whose entire life had been about understanding what was, The act of attempting to create was both exhilarating and terrifying. The climax of this chapter of his life came on a cold Tuesday night. He had been studying a sigil described in a 16th century grimoire, a relatively simple one said to bind chaos. He drew it meticulously on a piece of parchment, using charcoal powder mixed with consecrated water as the text instructed. As he finished the final line, he felt a strange stillness descend upon the room. The air grew heavy. The faint hum of the city outside seemed to fade for a single, suspended moment. He felt a profound, almost physical sense of order, as if the countless random vibrations of the universe had suddenly, perfectly aligned. He looked at his desk, and a small stack of papers that had been askew, a chaotic pile of notes, had subtly shifted, straightening themselves into a neat pile. It was a tiny thing, easily dismissed, a coincidence, a trick of the light, but Thorne, the historian, who believed in verifiable details, knew better. He had felt the pull, he had felt the sigil, a mere drawing on paper, exert a subtle, intelligent force on the world around it. The sigil wasn't a representation of an idea. It was an idea, given form, given life, and given a command. It was the first mark, and he now knew he had to understand the language of which it was a single, silent word. For him, the journey was only just beginning, a road that led deeper into the forgotten grammars of reality and the silent power that lay dormant in a single line. The first mark had been a key, and it had just turned in the lock. The subtle realignment of papers on his desk was a ghost Thorne could not exorcise. It haunted his every waking moment, challenging the very foundation of his academic worldview. A lifetime of intellectual rigor had taught him to dismiss such an anomaly as a coincidence, a trick of the mind, or a product of confirmation bias. But the feeling that accompanied it, a profound, almost deafening silence that had descended upon the world, was undeniable. It was the sensation of a direct cause, a consequence of his will translated into a physical act through the medium of the sigil. He began to view the world through a new lens, one filtered not by history and dates, but by lines and angles. He saw the subtle curves of the basilica where the slab was found, the precise proportions of its arches and domes, not as architectural choices, but as echoes of a deeper, more fundamental language. His research shifted from the what of history to the how of creation. He sought the blueprint, the underlying grammar that allowed a symbol to exert influence. His journey led him into the esoteric discipline of sacred geometry. He immersed himself in the works of Pythagoras and Plato, not for their philosophical dialogues, but for their mathematical treatises. He read of the Platonic solids, the 5 perfect 3-dimensional shapes said to be the building blocks of the cosmos. He studied the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio pH, realizing that these mathematical constants were not just beautiful curiosities, but the very architecture of growth and order in the natural world, from the spiral of a seashell to the branching of a tree. Thorne's breakthrough came when he began to see these principles reflected in the sigils themselves. The petrified slab from the basilica, when he measured its sigil with a precise caliper, revealed a hidden structure. The ratio of one arc to another was not random. It was a near-perfect reflection of the golden ratio. The angles were not arbitrary, they were precise, often relating to the degrees of a perfect circle in ways that human could not have drawn freehand without a profound understanding of the underlying mathematics. This was the intellectual leap. The power of a sigil wasn't in its artistic form, but in the specific, precise relationships of its lines and curves. The visual aspect was merely the skin. The power was in the skeleton of mathematical perfection. A sigil was not a drawing, it was a mathematical equation expressed graphically. He found echoes of this in every culture he studied, the mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism, which were not just meditation aids but complex geometric representations of the universe, the intricate geometric patterns in Islamic art, which symbolize the infinite nature of God, the ancient Celtic knotwork, which to an untrained eye appeared as complex decoration, but to Thorne now revealed itself as a series of interlocking, self-sustaining loops that symbolized the cyclical nature of time and eternity. In each case, the power was not in the image but in the grammar of its construction. The sigil from the grimoire, the one that had straightened his papers, was now a subject of intense, obsessive study. He dissected it line by line, curve by curve, and discovered that its power lay in the precise relationships of its parts. It was a closed system, a self-contained circuit of energy. Its lines converged at specific points, creating intersections that were not just visual, but were. He now hypothesized nodes of power, where intent could be focused and magnified. This new understanding led to the climax of his research in this chapter. He decided to recreate a more complex sigil, a task he undertook with a mixture of academic curiosity and genuine trepidation. The sigil, from an alchemical text he had unearthed in a hidden corner of his university's library, was said to crystallize intent. Its form was a series of nested triangles, each one offset at a precise angle from the last. Thorne spent days, then weeks, meticulously drafting the symbol. He used a compass and ruler, a level of precision that would have been absurd for a historian just a year prior. He ground his own pigments, following the alchemical instructions, and prepared the parchment. When he finally laid down the last line, completing the intricate, spiraling lattice of triangles, he felt nothing, no grand, physical phenomenon, no dramatic shift in reality. The room remained the same. He felt a profound disappointment, a cold dread that his entire hypothesis was wrong. Perhaps the straightening of the papers had indeed been a trick of the light, and he was just a desperate man grasping for meaning. He left the parchment on his desk, a testament to his folly, and went to bed. The next morning, he returned to his office. On his desk, nestled in the center of the geometric sigil he had drawn, was a single, perfect crystal. It was a small quartz-like mineral he had never seen before, and it had not been there the night before. The window was shut, the doors locked. There was no rational explanation. The sigil had not created the crystal from nothing, but it had, in some way Thorne could not yet comprehend, drawn it from the universe and given it physical form. The sigil, the intricate web of lines and angles, had been a funnel, a magnet, an intellectual machine that had, in his words, crystallized intent. The knowledge, the proof, was now tangible. The power of these symbols was not a trick of faith or a psychological phenomenon. It was a language, a physical law that was simply unwritten in our current textbooks. Thorne now understood that his research had to go beyond geometry and history. It had to go into the forbidden and the forgotten, to the shadowed places where this knowledge was kept. He had to find the source. The appearance of the crystal was an impossible truth, a silent, irrefutable argument that overturned everything Dr. Aris Thorne had ever believed. He no longer felt like a historian. He felt like an archaeologist of the unknown, digging through the layers of consensus reality to find a forgotten stratum of knowledge. The crystal, now encased in a small, velvet-lined box on his desk, was a constant reminder that the universe was far stranger and more malleable than his textbooks had ever suggested. He knew then that the information he needed was not in any sanctioned library or university archive. He had to go to the places where knowledge had been hidden, where the victors of history had not been able to burn or bury it. His search began in the deep, dark corners of the internet, a place he had previously only used for database searches. He found references in old forums, cryptic messages in academic footnotes, and whispered rumors in online communities dedicated to the esoteric. All of them pointed to a single mythical place, the Shadowed Archive. It was described not as a physical building, but as a network, a collection of forbidden texts, journals, and artifacts kept by a lineage of guardians who believed that some Knowledge was too dangerous to be lost, but also too potent to be made public. He spent months decoding the clues, a digital scavenger hunt that led him through dead websites, encrypted emails, and a series of anonymous drop-offs. The final clue, a simple hand-drawn map on a piece of parchment, led him to a small, unassuming bookstore in the back alleys of Vienna. The shop was a dusty labyrinth of old books, smelling of paper and decay. Behind the counter sat a man, a figure shrouded in shadow, whose face was a roadmap of lines and creases. He introduced himself simply as Elias. Elias was not an academic, he was a guardian, a custodian of the unwritten and the erased. He saw the world not as a collection of facts, but as a story with chapters ripped out. He had been waiting for someone like Thorn. He did not ask for credentials or proof of his academic standing. He simply asked, "What are you looking for?" "The history that was buried," Thorn replied. "The language before words." Elias smiled, a thin, knowing expression. "You've come to the right place." Elias led him through a hidden door, down a narrow flight of stone steps, and into the heart of the shadowed archive. It was not a grand library, but a series of interconnected, climate-controlled chambers, filled with shelves that held not just books, but scrolls of vellum, clay tablets, and even sheets of beaten copper etched with strange symbols. Here, history was not a linear progression, it was a vast, sprawling tapestry where different eras and beliefs coexisted, all unified by the common thread of forbidden knowledge. Thorn spent weeks in the archive, guided by Elias. He read of ancient civilizations that built their cities as giant sigils, believing they could harness the power of the land itself. He studied the secret societies of the Renaissance, who sought to rediscover a primal language of creation. He read the journals of alchemists who used sigils not to turn lead into gold, but to transmute their own consciousness. He learned of a specific group, the Ordo Veritatis Occultae, the Order of Hidden Truth, who were systematically hunted down and erased from historical record by religious and political powers who saw their knowledge as a direct threat to their authority. This led him to the heart of the chapter's historical revelation. He found a heavily redacted journal written by a member of the Ordo detailing the use of a powerful sigil in a political conflict. The journal described how the Ordo, in a desperate attempt to defend a small city-state from a much larger invading army, had not used swords or walls, but a single, massive sigil etched into the city's central square. The sigil was not for destruction, but for confusion. It was designed to sow dissent and doubt. The journal described how the invading army, on the verge of victory, suddenly turned on itself. Commanders began to distrust their own troops. Soldiers saw ghosts in their ranks. The chain of command simply disintegrated. The invasion collapsed, not because of a military defeat, but because the very will to fight had been erased. The sigil had not been a weapon of war, it had been a psychological weapon of immense power, a mark of pure, concentrated doubt. Concentrated. The climax of this chapter was the cold, chilling realization of the dark side of sigil craft. Up until this point, Thorn had viewed sigils through the lens of academic curiosity, a fascinating intellectual puzzle. But the journal entry changed everything. The power to give form to intent was not a neutral tool. It could be used to create, but it could also be used to destroy. It could straighten a pile of papers, and it could also break the minds of men. The sigil was not a key, it was a double-edged sword, and the history of its use was stained with blood. He realized that the knowledge was forbidden, not because it was false, but because it was terrifyingly, brutally effective. He looked at Elias, a man who had guarded this knowledge for a lifetime, and he understood the immense responsibility of his role. Thorn's quest for truth had just taken a perilous turn, moving from the purely intellectual to the profoundly moral. He was no longer just a researcher, he was a witness to a hidden history of spiritual warfare, and he knew that the next chapter of his journey would require more than just academic rigor. it would require a vow. The chilling truth of the Ordo Veritatis. Occult's sigil lingered in Dr. Thorne's mind like a cold fog, the image of an army dissolving into madness, not by sword, but by symbol. Was a revelation that stripped the romance from his intellectual pursuit. He was no longer a detached observer of history, he was a participant, standing at the precipice of a knowledge both profound and profoundly dangerous. Elias, the enigmatic guardian of the archive, seemed to sense this shift. He had watched Thorne pore over the historical accounts, his face a mask of neutral patience, only speaking when Thorne's internal struggle had become too obvious to ignore. "You see, now," Elias said, his voice a low rustle like old paper. "The veil is not there to hide the knowledge from you, it is there to hide you from the knowledge." This statement was the turning point for Thorne. The books he had read, the sigils he had analysed, they were not just texts to be deciphered, they were contracts, each one a testament to the fact that power came at a cost. The old mystics hadn't just drawn these symbols, they had invested a part of themselves into them. They had made a vow. This wasn't about belief in a theoretical sense, it was about the physical, mental, and spiritual energy required to bridge the gap between a line on a page and a change in the world. It was a form of spiritual metallurgy, where the self was the ore, and the sigil was the furnace. Thorne began to study the advanced sigils Elias now granted him access to, not just as geometric puzzles, but as records of sacrifice. He saw a pattern emerge in the journals of the ancient sigil crafters. They spoke of fasting, of meditation, of physical pain, and of mental focus so intense it bordered on mania. They spoke of the personal cost of activation. They understood that a sigil's power was not inherent in its shape alone, but was amplified by the life force, the focused will of the person who created it. The more a person was willing to give, the more potent the symbol became. This was the spiritual mechanics of sigil craft, a direct exchange of personal essence for manifest reality. His experiments in the quiet solitude of his university office took on a new, more serious tone. He started with a sigil for clarity, a simple lattice of intersecting lines. He prepared his mind for days, following the instructions in a monastic text, which spoke of clearing the lake of thought until it is a perfect mirror. He meditated for hours, focusing on a single, unwavering intention to see the truth of his research without fear or bias. The result was not a physical manifestation this time, but a terrifying internal one. For a moment, the veil between his conscious thought and the deeper, chaotic currents of his mind seemed to lift. He was flooded with a torrent of images, flashes of forgotten memories, irrational fears, and long-buried resentments. He saw himself not as the rational academic he pretended to be, but as a man consumed by pride and a desperate need for validation. The sigil had worked too well. It hadn't just given him clarity, it had turned that clarity inward, forcing him to confront a version of himself he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He collapsed, his head spinning, the room a dizzying spiral of self-revelation and terror. This was the first of the spiritual phenomena he experienced, a psychological price for his academic curiosity. The climax of this chapter was the most visceral and haunting. Elias had shown him a sigil of immense power, a complex mandala said to open the door to the hidden. He warned Thorne that the knowledge in the archive was not just for the living, it also held the echoes of those who had created it. Thorne, ever the rationalist, dismissed it as superstition. He set about recreating the sigil, a beautiful but alien tapestry of interlocked circles and curves. He worked late into the night, the silence of the archive pressing in on him. As he completed the final arc of the sigil, he felt a profound coldness, as if the air had been sucked from the room. He looked up, and for a single, horrifying moment, he saw it. He saw the sigil not on the page, but floating in the air before him, a shimmering, three-dimensional construct of pure light. From its center, a silent, terrifying vortex began to form. He saw not a vision of a world it had created, but a memory of its creation. He saw the face of the man who had first drawn it, a figure consumed by a desperate grief, a man who had used the sigil not for power, but to bargain with forces he could not comprehend. And in that glimpse, Thorn didn't just see a story, he felt the man's grief, his desperation, his all-consuming loneliness. He felt the vow, the terrible price paid, as if it were his own. The sigil had reached out and momentarily merged its history with his own mind. He recoiled in terror, scrambling back from the table, a gasp of pure shock escaping his lips. He now understood Elias's warning. The sigils were not just lines on a page, they were a living history, a collection of intentions, vows, and sacrifices. To engage with them was not to read a book, but to enter into a conversation with the dead, to stand on the same precipice they had stood on, and to feel the weight of their choices. He had seen the power, and he had now felt the price. His journey was no longer just an intellectual puzzle, it was a spiritual trial. He knew he had crossed a threshold, and that the path ahead would lead him to the origins of this language, to the first, terrible words of a forgotten god. The terror and profound grief Thorn had felt, a phantom pain from a dead man's vow, had changed him. He no longer saw his work as a quest for knowledge, but as a journey into a shared spiritual inheritance. The sigils were not just records of human intent. They were a collective memory, a library of powerful emotions and cosmic forces. He found himself drawn away from the specific, individual sigils, and toward a single, recurring symbol that he had seen in every text. From the petrified slab to the most ancient copper scrolls in Elias's archive, it was a complex, elegant symbol that was always depicted not as a human creation, but as a thing of nature etched into a meteorite, found in the grain of a sacred tree, or drawn by the path of stars. This sigil was unlike the others. It didn't seem to have a specific purpose. It wasn't a sigil for wealth or protection or clarity. It was a sigil for being. It was a self-sustaining loop of perfect, impossible geometry that seemed to contain all other forms within it. Its lines never ended, always returning to their origin point, a visual representation of a closed, eternal cycle. Thorn began to call it the first sigil. He felt a deep, almost religious awe for it, a sense of familiarity that transcended his intellect. His research became a grand synthesis of religious mythology and esoteric symbology. He began to see patterns that no academic in a sanctioned university would ever dare to propose. He read creation myths from around the world, the Hindu concept of the the primordial sound of creation, the Gnostic idea of a single, divine spark that brought the universe into being, the ancient Egyptian belief in the god Atum, who spoke the world into existence in each case. The act of creation was linked to a single word, a single vibration, a single original sound or thought that gave form to the void. The intellectual breakthrough that shattered his remaining academic reservations was the hypothesis that the first sigil was not a human invention, but a fossilized echo of that original creative act. It wasn't a symbol for a god, it was a fragment of the language of a god, a residual power from the moment of creation itself. The most potent sigils in history were not new creations, but clever, often accidental, rediscoveries of these primal echoes. They were shards of a divine language, scattered across the universe, and every sigil crafter, in their quest to shape reality, was simply attempting to speak a few words of this forgotten tongue. This theory explained why some sigils felt so ancient, so powerful, and so dangerous. It wasn't just the human will imbued into them, it was the fact that they were resonating with a fundamental cosmic vibration. The power was not in the symbol, but in the memory of the original word it represented. Thorn realized that the true power of a sigil was in its ability to act as a tuning fork, to resonate with the underlying structure of reality and bring a specific frequency and intention into being. The climax of this chapter was a terrifying and beautiful moment of realization. While examining a massive, weathered mural from a pre-dynastic Egyptian tomb, Thorn noticed that the first sigil was not just drawn, but seemed to be humming with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. He had a sudden, overwhelming vision, a flash of light, not of fire, but of pure, crystalline thought, expanding into an endless blackness. He felt the silence of the void, and then a single, perfect thought, a geometric command, a soundless name that exploded into the universe, shaping galaxies and giving birth to stars. The first sigil was a whisper of that original thought, a memory of a force so powerful it had to be systematically forgotten. He now understood that the true spiritual warfare wasn't between good and evil, it was between creation and oblivion, between the forces that wanted this primal language remembered and those that wanted it erased forever. The knowledge was so powerful, so fundamental, that those who came to understand it were often seen as a threat to the established order, be it religious, political, or even cosmic. The god of the first sigil was a forgotten one, a cosmic architect whose name had been lost, but whose language, in fragmented whispers and geometric echoes, remained. Thorn now knew he was no longer just a researcher of sigils. He was an interpreter of a divine dialect, a scholar of a primal tongue. And he was about to discover the master sigil, the one word that governed all others. The vision of the void and the first sigils perfect. Geometric thought had fundamentally rewired Thorn's perception. He no longer saw himself as a scholar of history, but as an interpreter of creation itself. The sigils were not just human tools, they were fragments of a cosmic blueprint. The true power was not in the lines, but in the divine grammar they represented. This new understanding drove him toward the most coveted and terrifying secret of the Shadowed Archive, the existence of a master sigil. Elias, seeing the profound change in Thorn, now granted him access to the oldest, most guarded section of the archive. Here, texts were not on paper or vellum, but etched into obsidian, inscribed on leather made from some unknown animal, and even woven into tapestries of a strange, shimmering thread. It was in one of these tapestries, its colours faded, but its intricate pattern still vibrant, that Thorn found a recurring motif. It was not a single sigil, but a composite, a complex system of interconnected symbols, each a variation of the first sigil, all woven together in a vast, sprawling lattice. This was not a word, but an entire sentence, the architect's hand. The philosophical challenge of this chapter was immense. Thorn had to grapple with the difference between creating something new and directing what already exists. The Ordo had created doubt. The alchemist had crystallized intent. But the architect's hand was different, according to the fragmentary notes found in the archive. This sigil did not create power, it directed it. It was a conductor's baton, not a musical instrument. Its purpose was to orchestrate the myriad, fragmented sigils that already existed, to bring them into a single, cohesive purpose. The intellectual breakthrough was the realization that the master sigil wasn't a source of power, but a key to controlling the very laws of reality, the rules that governed how thought becomes form. It was the ultimate expression of a singular, commanding will over a chaotic, multifaceted universe. This raised a chilling question about free will. If a master sigil could orchestrate reality, could it not also orchestrate the minds of men? The text hinted at this, speaking of the thin veil between will and destiny. The wielder of the architect's hand was not just a creator. They were an architect of fate, a puppeteer of causality. The potential for good was limitless, a sigil to heal the sick, to end famine, to bring lasting peace. But the potential for destruction was absolute, a sigil to erase an entire civilization, to unmake a law of nature, to rewrite the very essence of human experience. The narrative tension became a race against time. The fragments of the Master Sigil were scattered across different texts, each one a different piece of a cosmic puzzle. Thorn, with Elias's guidance, had to stitch them together. To see the whole pattern before a more sinister force could, he read of historical figures, long forgotten, who had come close to assembling the Sigil, only to disappear mysteriously, their work burned, their names erased. This was the true nature of the spiritual warfare Elias had spoken of, a secret war waged for millennia, a quiet, unseen conflict over the right to wield the ultimate command of the universe. The climax was a tense, intellectual thrill. Thorn, working feverishly in the hushed silence of the archive, finally connected the last piece of the puzzle. He saw the full, terrifying form of the architect's hand, a sprawling, elegant, and impossibly complex sigil that seemed to thrum with a silent, dormant power. He had not drawn it, he had simply understood it. Assembling the pieces in his mind, the moment the final line connected, the entire archive seemed to hold its breath. Elias, who had been a silent sentinel, looked at him with an expression of profound gravity. Thorn felt a wave of cold, absolute power wash over him, not the grief of the last chapter, but a pure, unfeeling sense of authority. He saw the world not as a collection of things, but as a system of forces waiting for a command. He was no longer just a scholar, he was an architect, and he held the key to the ultimate command. The choice was now his, what to do with a power that could either save or condemn the world. The architect's hand was not a sigil Thorn could simply draw. It was not a physical form, but a perfect idea he now held in his mind. The terrifying beauty of it was that it was not a thing to be used. It was a way of seeing. The Master Sigil was the lens through which he could finally understand the language of reality. And with that understanding came the ultimate and most profound of all choices. The intellectual journey had ended. The moral one had just begun. Elias, the old guardian, stood before him, the ancient tapestry shimmering with the reflected light of the archive's single, quiet lamp. He had watched generations of seekers come and go. Most had been consumed by the power. A few had been consumed by fear. Thorn, Elias saw, was consumed by neither. He was simply holding the weight of it. The knowledge is a seed, Elias said, his voice a dry whisper. You can plant it, or you can crush it. Either way, the world will never be the same for you. This was the core of the final chapter, not an action, but a decision. Thorn, the meticulous historian who had spent his life cataloguing what was, now held the power to shape what could be. He could reveal the existence of sigilcraft to the world, offering humanity a key to its own reality. He could give them the tools to heal, to build, to solve the crises that plagued their existence. But he also knew the terrible history of the Ordo Veritatis, Occulte, the psychological warfare, the destruction sown by a simple sigil. He knew that knowledge was a double-edged sword, and that in the hands of the unprepared, it would be used not for creation, but for absolute, unchecked power. The world was not ready for a god, and he was not ready to be one. He looked at the crystal on his desk, the first tangible proof of his journey. He looked at the endless shelves of the archive, filled with the shattered fragments of a forgotten god's language. He looked at Elias, the ancient sentinel who had chosen to guard this knowledge rather than wield it, and in that moment he understood the truth that lay beneath all the symbols and all the history. The greatest power was not the ability to command reality, but the will to choose not to. The ultimate act of free will was to refuse to be the architect of another's fate. The closing was not a triumphant summary, but a haunting realization. Thorn did not write a new history, he chose to honor the one that was. He did not share the architect's hand, he chose to carry it in his mind. As a burden and a vow, the sigils were not a hidden key to a grand, powerful secret, they were a mirror. They reflected the ultimate truth about human nature, our desire to control the uncontrollable, and the terrible price we are willing to pay for it. He chose to be the final guardian, the end of the line, the unwritten epilogue to a story that, for now, had to remain sealed. The video ends with the camera slowly pulling back from Thor, who stands alone in the archive, surrounded by a silence that is now no longer academic, but sacred. He has found the answer, and the answer is that some questions are best left unasked. He has discovered a truth so profound it must remain a secret, a testament to the fact that power, in its purest form, is not a command, but a choice. Knowledge buried for centuries, now uncovered, and still, there's more. For those drawn to secrets, perhaps subscribing is not a click, it's a vow.